welcome everybody today, and for the ones online and for the ones here. I know it's last week of school and not many people around, but it's interesting because this was requested by parents. So a lot of parents contact us to have this conversation, Ibu. And for me, it's a really amazing opportunity also as a parent to know better about Ibu Jennifer and, you know, about her and connect with her and with her story and the things that she's bringing here to Green School. And we would love to start, you know, fostering more of these conversations around different topics. So more to come. We've been talking a lot about it, and more to come next year. And today is also the last talk of the year. So thank you, Ibu, to be here. And without any further ado, please, Ibu Jennifer, our middle and high school counselor.
That's right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome.
So I've been asked to use this microphone. I'm not really great with the microphone, but I think for the recording purposes, I'm going to use this. But this is a talk I've given. I've worked in international schools since the 90s. And so I actually was raised internationally, as most of your students in 6 through 12 know. They know my story. I talked to them about it in my first introduction. And so I moved overseas when I was about 9 years old. My dad took a job. My dad was a geochemist. He worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, and the Saudi government asked him to go to Saudi Arabia to work on some mapping. And so that was my first international experience. And I ended up, my dad stayed there, and I ended up going to a boarding school. So I did my 9th grade year in Saudi Arabia, my 10th grade year in a boarding school, because at the time there were no high schools in Saudi Arabia. And then I did 11th and 12th grade at a boarding school in Athens, Greece. So I kind of know firsthand what it feels like to be moving around a lot like these students are. And then I chose to go internationally, and partly because I was working in a public school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was a pretty rough area. It was right next to this state penitentiary. Pretty intense work I was doing, and I realized my son was young at the time, and I realized I wanted him to have this experience. So I moved him overseas, and he attended schools with me, and he actually graduated from Taipei American School and is now working in the United States. Actually, he has a master's degree in experiential education, so it kind of fits with what I think the Green School ethos is. But I developed this actually when I worked it was when I was working in Morocco is when I developed it, this idea for me to actually understand who the parents are, who the families are. And so I have done this workshop with the 9th and 10th graders at the beginning of October, or middle of October when I first arrived. So they actually sat through this same sort of thing to get to kind of understand this feeling of being an international student and what it feels like to attend these international schools. So if you can click to the next slide. You know, a lot of times when I do workshops, especially with bigger people, I do what are called entrance and exit slips. But we're a pretty small group here, and hopefully you'll feel okay maybe sharing a couple things. But just to get a sense of you and your parenting, what are your greatest joys and your biggest challenges as parents? They make you happy. When your parenting doesn't align with your partner's parenting. A little bit of a challenge there for sure. Others? See, yeah. Right. Okay. So seeing those big ideas come up. And that can sometimes be a challenge too, because you then see something that maybe doesn't fit in your, realm as well. So I think especially in the high school years, some things can both be joys and challenges. But definitely seeing them come up with new ideas, seeing them come up with new ways of thinking. Any others?
Challenge in terms of just growing up in a different age to them.
Okay. Growing up in a different age, definitely one that I think is challenging the technology for sure.
Being a single parent with no patience.
I agree, and I think that's interesting. We have a challenge of, someone saying when you have two parents who don't have the same side, same thing. I remember one time, I was actually in an airport in Venezuela, and a few things were going wrong. We were supposed to be traveling with these cats, and they wouldn't put the cats on the plane, and I had a little bit of not one of my most elegant moments as I was and I remember saying, fine, if I can't put these cats, take cat food, I'm going to just let him out here. And my son, who was like this, he's like, what are you doing? I was because I was overwhelmed. I didn't know what to do. And later on, I said to him, I'm really sorry that you only see me get mad. I wish that, because I was a single mother too, I wish you had someone else to see get mad, because that can be hard being a single mother, so I can really relate to that. Any others? Any other thoughts about joys? Okay. Yeah. Parent guilt. Guilt. Not a lot of description there, but definitely I think as parents we often have some of that guilt. Any others there?
Finding the appropriate parenting style and staying consistent with it.
Consistency can sometimes be really hard, yeah. But I think these are really good questions to ask, because sometimes when we are in the challenges, we lose sight of the joys. And sometimes when we're in the joys, it's a really good time to talk about the challenges with your kids, because a lot of times it's a more patient area, they're able to kind of respond to it. But thinking about this a lot and being able to talk to each other is a really good way, I think, to move on. Next slide. So one of the things that I came into the international school teaching is for this intercultural awareness. And this is from UNESCO, and this was some of the things they are talking about in order to develop interculturally competent students, that they respect, value others, self-awareness, have a different sense of identity, able to see from other worldviews. They actually are noticing that people who grow up in this intercultural often have better listening skills. They're able to hear those other points of view and really listen to them. Adaptation. Our students are usually really adaptive, and they often can forge these really long-lasting cultural bonds across cultures that often in your home culture, they may not be able to make those kinds of bonds. Cultural humility and open-mindedness are a few things that I think come up with this. And the next slide. But one of the things that's really difficult about this is that it really makes it hard sometimes to have a cultural base. And that's why I chose to start with the parenting across cultures, to get you guys to kind of understand that. Because a lot of the research around this, and I'll go into that a bit more, is saying that we're building these very interculturally competent students, but that sometimes that sense of real identity that we get from one culture is a little bit harder to find. And so I've heard all these terms. You're an international student, you're an international, a bicultural, multicultural, you're cross-cultural, you're globally mobile, you're a traveler, you're a migrant, you're an immigrant, you're a global nomad. All of these are some of the words that we throw around to describe our students. But the one that at least sticks with me, and I don't like the name, is the third culture kid. And maybe it's because that was the first research I came across when I was younger, and I read a book called Third Culture Kids by Ruth Van Raken and David Pollock, and I was probably in my early 20s, and I had also studied psychology, and it was like, wow, this book talks about what my life is like. And so for me, this was the first time I came across this. And if you go to the next slide, how many of you have heard about TCKs, or third culture kids? Okay, and it's a bit overused, but it does, I think, capture some of the things that we are dealing with as far as parenting students, because so many parents had one rooted background. They lived in one place till they were 18, and then they brought their kids overseas. I know that was the case for my parents, and so a lot of times my parents couldn't quite understand what my schooling was like, because they had been in one place for their entire lives. And so Ruth and David Pollock's work starts to talk about this. Like any research, I feel like there's a few shortcomings as well. But basically, if you've never seen the research on TCKs, it's someone who has spent a significant part of their developmental years in a culture other than that of their parents. And you end up developing a sense of both. In a way, parents can return home to their country of origin, but the children often have a little bit of a difficulty returning home. And I'm using this to kind of orient you because if you're talking about parenting, a lot of times what we do in parenting is we pass on culture. And we don't pass it on with some, kind of lessons or anything. It just sort of comes. And then suddenly your kids arrive in this international school where they're going to have different cultures thrown at them, different viewpoints. And sometimes I think that can be one of the difficult challenges. So the next slide shows this idea. And I was doing this. I was in India. I was leading a presentation about third culture kids. Before this, I never liked the term, but this is when I really didn't like the term. And I was explaining to them that, for instance, when I was young, I came from the United States, and at a young age, I moved to Saudi Arabia. I didn't fit into Saudi Arabia, and of course, as adults, Saudi Arabia is a bit of a, probably a little bit more repressive with women, so I didn't get to go out into the culture. But what I did was I went to an international school that had this shared third culture. And at the time, I had a good friend from Denmark, I had a good friend from South Africa. I had friends from different parts of the world that we made a third culture here. But I started adding these dots when a young man, he was 15 at the time, from France, and I was doing the talk, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I'm not a third culture kid, I'm an 8 culture kid." And I had already been talking to him because he was having some struggles with adapting into our school, not because he wasn't bright or anything, because he had literally, his parents had either lived 1 year or 2 years in 8 countries by the time he was 15. So he was really missing kind of this sense of identity and who is he at this point. And I loved when he said, "I'm an 8 culture kid." So now a lot of times when I do the work with kids, I say, "How many cultures are you? How many cultures?" Because it also allows the bicultural families that are here. Or in some cases, even tricultural if grandparents are from 2 different countries and then your parents are from 2 different countries. So this is a little grounding in that. And the next slide. But this is one of the things that I came across this a while ago, and I just think it's really interesting. You will never be completely at home again because part of your heart will always be elsewhere. That is the price you pay for the richness of loving and knowing people in more than one place. And I think that a lot of our students have this in them. We do as adults, but we're able to process it a little bit more, especially if you've moved internationally as an adult. You're able to then still say, "I have this home, I have a place where I can always go back and feel a part of." But a lot of our kids don't have that. And on the next slide, I kind of talk about some of what the research is saying that are happening, maybe I'd call it joys and challenges. But this one here, Unresolved Grief, is one that really speaks to me. And I think it's one that's really important for parents to be aware of. When we talk about grief and we talk about the stages of grief, a lot of the psychological theories were built around when you lose someone, when someone passes on. And there's a real finality to that. You know that is sort of the end. But what they're starting to find and starting to study a lot about the third culture kids is that some of these kids, this French boy who had lived in 8 different cultures, has compounded grief, compounded losses that are there. And it's going to be hard to untangle those, especially for someone who had to, he'd never lived in France. He spoke French. He started at a Turkish school, I think, first. And then his parents thought it would be a great idea for me to then, when we go to China, put him in a Chinese school. So he really had no foundational language for the academic side. But what was, I think, harder for him was the losses. And we started talking about this and just identifying, what did you leave behind? What did you lose in this kind of process? And so it was a lot of, I had to leave behind a dog once. Huge thing for certain ages. I had to leave behind a good friend once. I had to leave behind the nanny or whatever it would have been called in that culture. So all of these losses really compound in students, and I think what it does is creates people who get protective, get a little protected. They don't want to always open up. And he was very friendly, but he was adamant, I'm not going to make a close friend here because I'm going to be leaving in 2 years. And so this is one kind of orientation to be thinking about. You know, we've got all these great things over here, but we've got these things, a sense of rootlessness. When I talk to the kids, I always say, how many of you can sing the national, or can recognize, I used to say sing, can recognize the national anthem from your home passport country? Most people can no longer do that. But not that that's a huge cultural marker as much anymore, but it is something that makes you think, where am I home? Where am I coming from? And I think sometimes this trouble with intimacy comes within kids who are moving a lot. So I share this first part with you to be able to be aware of it and to start having those conversations. What are you gaining from being in the Green School? What are you gaining from moving to Bali? What are you gaining from having people of different cultures in your class? Opening up that conversation can be really helpful. And then also opening up the conversation of this side of it. What are some of the confusions that are happening? What are some of the questions that you know, that, or the things you've lost, or this kind of thing? It can really help, I think, sometimes to deepen that parent relationship, you know, that you have with them. I know when my, you know, I was talking about the joys and challenges. When my son went from 8th to 9th grade, my son used to always be like, are you reading another one of those books? Because as my job, I read a lot of parenting books and things, and I'd be like, yeah, I'm reading another one of those books. One of the things I found that if I left those books on the table, he'd actually read them. One time I walked in, so he was in 8th grade, and I had gotten a How to Be a High School Student book, and just had it on, and I was like, oh, I got some new books to read, and I remember I walked into the living room at the time, and something went flying across the room, and it went underneath the chair over there, and I'm like, hey, how was school today? So yeah, you know, we talked a little bit, and then he's like, oh, I'm gonna go, and he went, and I went over there and looked, and he had the book, but he didn't want to admit that he was reading that book, because he didn't want me to think, well, he didn't want to think he needed that book. But like I remember asking him one time, you're going into high school, what do you need from me? What can I do better? How can I be a better parent? It's changes when you go into high school. What kind of changes can I do that may help you out a little bit? And being him, and also being a young man that didn't often know the answer to some of these kinds of questions, he was like, oh, I don't know. I was like, well, think about it and come back. And then he did come back, and one of the things he said was, you could make more cookies like Miss Stalder does, you know, his friend. And I was like, excellent, I could do that. That's an easy one. Actually, I went and asked her to make some just as sort of a joke. But we started processing it a little bit more, and it made him start to talk about what a mother was like, what helped him. And we ended up having some really good conversations. So sometimes taking this kind of knowledge and going back and just talking with your kids is a good way to move forward. But I think it's important to know that when you do choose to raise your kids in an international environment, there's going to be challenges that happen. And the next slide is about cultures. When cultures come together and meet, it can also be a collision of values. It can be a shock to the values. And I think a lot of times we start, how do we really learn culture? And the next slide, there's a lot of controversy about this in the anthropological world, is whether Hall's theory of sort of the cultural iceberg is the best way to look at culture. But it's really helpful for kids to see this, especially. And so the theory is that what's above the iceberg is the visible parts we see of culture. So when I moved to India, I would see this, I could taste these wonderful foods, I'd see these wonderful clothes, you know, you'd see dances and celebrations and things, music. That's the visible part. But what's underneath it are these really difficult things about modesty, beauty, our child rearing, parenting, inheritance, justice, authority, deportment, how we carry ourselves, nonverbal communication, time, language, social interaction. All of these things are here, and I think one of the challenges of the international school is that we then create our own culture that we kind of expect you to adapt to and buy into. But it's hard to know. I moved from Italy to Zurich in one of my moves, and basically if someone said come to dinner tonight at 8 o'clock in Italy, it would be fine if I showed up at 9. They would never think anything of that because the time, sort of thing is a little bit looser in Italy. But in Zurich, if I showed up at 7:05, there would be some times when someone would say, "Oh, you got held up?" Or, "Oh, you're running late." That difference in time is something that we don't always learn, these kinds of cultural things. And emotions. The way we express emotions are really different. And so what I want to do, I think the next slide has a little bit of time for discussion. So if you'll click. I'm not going to do the sorting. There's not enough people in here. But basically when I've done this in large groups is that I ask you to self-select based on your home culture, where you feel you are from, because it can create some really rich discussions. But since we just have a small group in here, we can do this together. And the next one slide is sort of, you start to identify your culture. And so where are you from? Where did you move here from? 2 very different questions to talk about in terms of your culture, and the kids will often see this with that. But just really quickly, if we can just sort of go around, let's start over here. Where do you consider yourself to be from? Yeah, where are you from? Okay, and where'd you move here from? Okay, great. And, yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. Yep. Okay. 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 Back here. Okay. Okay. And back here. Denmark and Denmark. India and India. Okay. 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 And do you guys want to join where you're from back here? Sorry. Okay. Okay. Oh, okay. No, that's why it can be complicated. And over here? Where are you from? Bali? Jakarta? Bali? Oh, okay. So more specifics. And at home, do we have anyone typing in where they're from? Oh, okay. Yeah, the next one I'll make sure, because there was a lot of people from a lot of different places. And are people typing in where they're from? Goa? Okay. Okay, London, UK. And so when you have all these people coming together, and we could get into why you chose the Green School, but maybe I'll save that for another topic. When you start to get into these kinds of questions, and especially with our kids, you have all these different things. What I usually do with them is I say, stand up if you speak one language. Confuses them, because a lot of them think, well, I speak more, but I want them all to stand up. And then I'll say, stay standing if you speak 2, 3, 4, 5. And in this kind of a culture, there will often be kids who stand up for 5 or even 6 languages. And again, it's and I let them define how they speak the language. But these kinds of rich cultural backgrounds are coming in. How many countries have you lived in? I'll often do stand up if you've lived in one country, and I'll get kids who will have moved around a lot. So my point in starting with this is to show how many cultural backgrounds are there. And if we look at the next slide, No, I'm not going to do this one now. Next slide. Next slide. When you bring all these people from different cultures together, you're going to have different expectations. And so as a counselor, I've been trained to be, and I've also done university, but I'm trained in social emotional learning. So I work with the social side, the academic side, and the emotional side with students. That's what some of my background is. And so if you start thinking for a minute of your dominant viewpoints of your culture. So when I've done this in large groups and I have all the Americans who recently, especially I usually have to, if it's a big group, anyone who just recently came from America, if you haven't lived in America a long time, if you've come from the UK, if you've come from the UAE or the Arabic world, I bring people together to talk about these questions. What are your shared cultural groups' viewpoints regarding school, academics? What are the goals? What do you expect from the teaching and learning style? What is classroom behavior like? What is the homework like, or the grades? How are people graded? What is the norm about obedience, that sort of thing? And what are the future pathways goals? And so what I want you to do right now is find someone next to you, and maybe join in over here. And I just want you to take a few minutes to share your cultural, not what you want from the green school or why you brought your kids here, but for you being in India, what do you think are the cultural background view about school, about academics? And if you're sitting next to someone who's from the United States, you might hear something slightly different. But choose any one of these and just for a minute talk to your neighbor about that. And those of you at home, if you want to join in like on a chat, or we could do a breakout room. Any clarifying questions?
What they are or what we expect them to adopt from it.
No, what were they for your, what were you grown up with more? What does your culture expect? The next slide will talk a little bit more about what you might expect now.
So tell me, everything is, grades are very important. If homework, everything is very, homework is extremely important. Parents get upset if the schools don't give homework. Extremely, they believe that if you don't follow the rules, then you're being disrespectful. School goals and expectations. School goals, basically, you have to top your class. Always 90 percentile. Always. Teaching and learning style is by rote. It all ends up learning by rote.
Learning what?
By heart. By heart. Like there's no repeating.
Okay.
No individualism.
For me, when I read about obedience, it sounds like a dog, because we are not like that. I think I grew up in communist country where it was your duty to protest and not care about authority if you were in a little bit outside the family, which I was. So it's not nothing like you. It was also like learning numbers, learning dates, but it was not. The parents were not taking a big part in pushing the kids to do it. It's more relaxed. The approach.
Because there is this.
Are they in a group? How many are in there? Okay. So if you take 1 minute.
Because for us, we have a free education. We have always had a free education for everyone. So it's not a 1 minute like in uni it's free or goes until I mean it's very cheap. So it's
So I'm going to ask you to wrap up in about a minute.
So I talked a little bit about it in the beginning, so when we're starting a series of the hot topics, or maybe I can be specific now about would you guys would like to start a parent kind of ongoing conversation? Is that something that is yes?
Like discussion circle type.
Okay, let me know when they come back.
By the parents. We can support it and facilitate. Yeah?
I can be more specific, but I told them that we were starting to organize these hot topics, conversations. I already said in the beginning, but I'll wrap up.
Okay. Okay, so if you can wrap up that last thought.
Yeah.
So it's always, it always happens when I ask parents to talk that they just can continue on for quite a long time. But I will say it was really interesting when I did this with the students, 9th and 10th grade. So I had, maybe 50 students in there, and I asked them to sit together in their cultural groups and have these conversations. And it helps me to learn a lot. But I'm just curious if there's any highlights, commonalities, differences, what one or two things that you were talking about.
Okay, I'll start with the microphone so people can hear online. In our group was interesting because 3 came from India, and kind of all of those were really important, like the rules and obedience and the grades and homework. Like parents get upset with the school if the school doesn't send homework. And then for me in Brazil, I think future pathways and career goals are really important, kind of like what you want to give a really good education for your kids because you want to give them better choices in the future, better opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So the better opportunities that education can bring to you, it's really big in the culture. For Jarka, that came from a communist country, she said that obedience was like, no way, you need to be protesting, you need to be voice and vocal about it. And they were very relaxed. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I think this is an interesting one too. The future pathways question always comes in because it is something that's really having worked as a university counselor for years and getting non-American, and not all countries, but a lot of non-American students to write a college essay, which is all about me, I did this, I did that, can sometimes be quite a challenge coming from cultures where you're not supposed to stand out. You're not supposed to. I worked in India for 4 years. It was always a big challenge to get them to talk about these strengths because they thought they were showing off. So again, cultural backgrounds comes into this. Any other thoughts or comments?
Who wants to say? Talk.
So I'm from Pakistan and Christian is from Indonesia, and we had fairly similar experiences to share. So whether it's grades, rules, obedience, everything was very, very structured, very much you stayed in a box. And regarding pathways, just adding to the conversation, you were either meant to be a doctor or an engineer, and that's kind of where it where you should land for a successful life ahead of you. And that was very straightforward.
I think looking at that is really important. And the next slide is actually pretty much the same thing, but looking at why what are your expectations about these similar types of things? I should have put future pathways on here. I thought I added it. But what are your expectations in sending your child or children to the Green School?
Should
I didn't come here for the academics of the school.
Okay. Not necessarily for the academics of the school?
I brought the kids to Green School really to give them an education around resilience and to learn completely differently to how I learned, which was parrot fashion, sit there, recite this, learn this, because I can't remember anything from my schooling.
Most of us can't. Actually, you can remember a lot on the next slide, probably. Any other reason, any other thoughts about it in really in relation to what your expectations are here?
for
Back?
me,
Oh, yeah?
yeah, okay. For me, it was about the teaching and learning style. Really, I mean, really resonates with Miki said now about giving them a different experience from what I had, and wasn't inspiring what I had, and I felt a lot of inspirational for him bringing him here. Look.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, I grew up like this, and so did all my friends, because, you know, it was 10 countries, you know, 6 by the time I was 18. But I went to high school in Singapore in United World College, which was fantastic, and I really liked it. And then I put my kids in United World College years later in Singapore. But it had changed, and it seemed like it was a stress, and everyone was stressed out about grades, and there was a whole sort of the train towards uni. And so I was trying to find a school like I thought I had. But then when I was in the same school, I felt that it had changed, and so the no homework, no grades, no stress was super important, because everyone was on suicide watch, and it was just a bit much.
And I think that's one of the unique things about this school, is that people come here for a variety of different reasons. But I will admit, it was hard for me. I only came here in the middle of October, and I've been in these traditional schools where grades, IB, this sort of thing, and I'm counseling kids who are falling apart, they're stressed. And I came in here, and my first thought was, oh, I better start talking about stress and anxiety, because that's one of the biggest things I'm feeling in my other schools. And there's kids, they're still feeling stress or anxiety. We haven't even touched on how COVID has impacted them, or how, different, the stress and anxiety is definitely different. But it is definitely, the academic stress, I think, is a lot less here, which is really good, but that can also sometimes lead to maybe, I don't want to say, apathy is too strong of a word, but not trying as hard sometimes too, that can come in. That balance is such an important part with this kind of thing. And again, knowing what your expectations are, knowing what you're wanting, sometimes it's not going to match up with the school, no matter what school it is. Sometimes there will be things that do not match with the school, and I think that's where the real work goes, because mom at home is expecting this, or dad is putting this pressure on, and student is going, wanting to go a slightly different way, or the school is going a slightly different way, and that can be really hard at times. So the academics is one part. The next slide, we're going to do the same sort of thing. Probably you won't have to talk too much about social media in your own experience growing up, but definitely what are the cultural expectations regarding the social norms? What are the rules, expectation for girls, boys, for friendship, groups, phones, dating? What is the parenting expectation? I know some old school quotes, kids should be seen and not heard as a parenting expectation. We're not going to take as long on this one, but again, going into a breakout group at home for the people online to sort of chat a little bit about socially, what do you see was different for your own cultural, or what were the basis of your own cultural background as far as social aspects? And just partner up again.
Gender and diversity was kind of not really mentioned too much.
Gender and diversity, yeah.
I mean, not that it was suppressed or anything, but it was not discussed.
Was there any diversity, like even racial diversity discussions, or was it still pretty?
We had gypsies. That was, yeah, gypsies and Vietnamese. That's the only. We are a very landlocked country with no.
We were told to be afraid of or be scared of the transsexual people in India. Like they would only come at certain times, and it was always like, go away, go away. Like even now, when I see them, my instinctive thing is to be fearful of them. Although I realize that there's no need, but that was what the first reaction was. And all of that, there was a gender bias was very dominant. It still is. Like girls and boys, how they have to behave is extremely high.
No, roles and expectations for sure. Brazil is so sexy.
We don't have really this because like.
Later, just keep in mind this. Yes. No, you can. No, for now, nobody.
One thing about communism was that there was a full employment, so everybody was going to work. So women were not staying at home, so everybody was working and making money. So it was more equal.
Yeah.
Still, like always men were a bit.
I mean, parties and going out, I think we are more relaxed in Brazil than other countries.
Yeah,
a little bit. Right, racial diversity. I mean, Brazil
I'm
is
so glad I'm going to
a
be
mix
picking
of
on
cultures. That was how we were colonized in the first place. You know, we had immigrants from Portugal and from Italy, from Spain and from German and Japan. We have the biggest Japanese group outside of Japan. It's in São Paulo, you know, it's the whole kind of Japanese town in São Paulo. So there is this very diverse, and all the Africans that came as well, you know. And it's interesting because the Portuguese, they mixed in Brazil as well.
They didn't stay separated so much.
They didn't stay separated, they mixed, you know, with the natives. They like the girls.
For me, racial diversity is more from the different states rather than the countries. It's more because every state, the different language. And so that.
Okay, so if you want to wrap up that thought.
I had my boyfriend sleeping at our house when I was in high school, like.
I don't know, no, my mom.
I mean, she resisted, but then.
And this is one where.
Also, 17 was already okay.
No, I mean, according to my mom, when I was 17. According to my parents, I was a virgin till I got married.
Okay, I'll go back there.
Okay. Okay. So I can hear a lot of chatter here and a lot of really interesting conversations. I noticed kind of going around and a couple of people over here are still talking, but one, as they finish up, one that came back here was actually talking about, the partnership generationally is a little bit different, and even though they were in the same, in Indonesia, that just the differences in these kinds of expectations over what's the difference, 14 years difference?
So Cleo graduated from her high school 14 years after me.
Okay.
Yeah, so a big gap.
And you notice differences in most of these, or just particular ones? Most of them. Okay. So again, this is something too that I think comes into it. I've been doing this for many years. I am moving into the wise sage role in my age, which really makes it different for me, even working with a lot of your kids, because of my experience being so different. They do like to hear that I didn't even have a telephone in Saudi Arabia. They thought that was a big deal for them. But, some differences. And over here, your group had a conversation about what?
Yes, dating. We started with dating, and actually, we're kind of similar generation, but for me in Pakistan, similar. Oh, the three of us, the three of us. And it was somewhat different. So there was a lot of flexibility in how Dan and Kate were raised, and sort of open door policies regarding dating. So it's okay within certain boundaries. And for me in Pakistan, it was not okay unless it led to marriage. So If it's going to get you the ring, it's okay. Otherwise,
Oh, the open door. Yes, yes, yes. Oh, so keep the door open when your girlfriend or boyfriend is here. And I think this is an excellent one. I was doing this presentation once, and I had a group from Arabic-speaking countries or Muslim countries, and I had a group from Australia, New Zealand, and a few South Africans who didn't have another group to join. So they joined because it was the Tri-Nations Rugby Cup at the time. And they were like, wow, we share so many things in common on this. And then when it came to the dating, I asked about that. And the group from the Arab speaking Middle East, when I said dating, they were like, no. And then they stopped talking. Like, it was just like, no, this isn't going to happen. And I remember saying, so now your kids are in an international school, and you've just heard about the fact that in one of these mothers said, oh, yes, my first kiss, it wasn't really a real kiss, but it was a little kiss, like a little peck in second grade. And they were shocked, first of all, that you would have a kiss, even think about a kiss. And then I said, well, what are you guys going to do if their son asks your daughter out, or your son asks their daughter out? And their first response was, they won't. It won't happen. Impossible. And it led to this great discussion about, we have all these values that are in this school that are going to clash with each other, and they're going to clash with your own values at times. And how do you as parents begin to handle that? So I think the social norm is really important. And again, the next slide is just the same thing with the expectations amongst the Green School.
I think people who come to Green School, in a way, are already pre-selected for a bit more freedom, even if they come from more restrictive cultures, because otherwise they wouldn't have chosen the school. Not completely, but...
But that does lead to, why do you choose this? For what social reasons? Is it that you want them to know people from other cultures? Is it that you want them to challenge their social norms and beliefs? I heard a couple groups that said, in my home culture, the roles for boys and girls are very strict. And I think that's true, but what is the culture here? And how can we, as educators, support you all with what your beliefs are? And this would be a much longer conversation. I'm really mindful of the time, because I think we're kind of getting close, at least to the end of the produced time. Were there any comments or in the chat from home that that we could kind of ask how things they were talking about?
So no, they don't talk anything about the norm.
Okay. But I think it is important to, start thinking about that. And for me, I'm new. I've got Dan and Kate in the back. They could probably be much better Green School cultural experts than I can about what are the social norms. But as you know, and if someone was in the middle school conversation, I'm having a lot, at least at middle school level, a lot of talks about the social. And middle school is when socialization, it kind of overrides the academics a lot of times, because developmentally they're trying to learn these roles. And I know that a lot of the group work in the Green School is designed to create strong social bonds and to kind of talk about it. But I would say that the phones, social media, friendship, dating, at least I know in the middle school, a little bit of talk going on about this. I think that it is, when it comes down to cliques and social exclusion, I think there is, in any school I've ever worked with, some of those instances of, well, and it's different maybe than, oh, you can't hang out with that cultural group, but there definitely are some defined friendship groups that happen in all middle schools that we need to talk about. So as parents, having that conversation is super important. And just being mindful of the time. The next slide. Okay, so yeah, this one, if we had a lot of time, we'd talk about why you come here for the social reasons, but let's just go quickly to the emotional side of things. What are the emotional, and this was really interesting for me when I moved to Taipei American School, learning a little bit about the emotions there. But how is your cultural group regarding the expression and displaying of emotions? How do you feel about sharing personal stories and keeping secrets? This is something that sometimes is really hard from a cultural perspective. Expressing emotions in public, private, with friends at home, and just, we don't have, I think, a lot of time, but 2 minutes with your group. What comes up for you about your own culture in terms of the emotional side?
Yeah, we know. I can answer for the Brazilian.
Do you want to chat together again real quickly, or?
I mean, I think you definitely for Brazil display emotions and everything. Like,
I think a traditional Indian family, you don't talk about it. It's all supposed to be disappear.
The southern nations are
Yeah. So we are going to kind of come back. I have a few more talking points. So with this one, as you come back together, are there any I think this one is one that you see a lot of differences in culture with this. You know, the whole Southern European, Northern European, debates of Italy showing all their emotions and Germany being a little bit more closed. Different cultures do express emotions differently. But one of the things that neuroscience is showing us is that the teenage brain actually does respond to emotions more strongly. They're starting to do studies. Dan Siegel has a great book, The Teenage Brain, and they will respond, and they do all kinds of studies to show that the emotional response is quite high at this age. And so they do talk about it more. They do share things. This idea of keeping stories, personal stories. A lot of times parents will have an expectation. They'll tell the kids something that's going on, and they'll have this expectation that the student won't share it, but the student does often share that, and it can create some kinds of difficulties within there or within the different people. So understanding the emotional side is important. I have tried to go to each grade level this term and do some presentations on emotions, on sharing of emotions. I'm using some of Dan Siegel and Mark Brackett's work to talk to the kids about this idea, because a lot of the research is showing that when we don't share our emotions, it causes more difficulties. So if I go back to this idea of unresolved grief, when I was in 5th grade, my parents, I had a friend, her name was Stephanie, and I'm in 5th grade. I can't even remember ever doing anything with Stephanie, but apparently she was very important to me at the time, because I was at home, I was crying because that day I had learned that Stephanie was leaving. And I was crying and I was crying, and oh my gosh, my best friend is leaving me. And I remember my mom, being very comforting, and my mom was a very comforting person. She comforted, and she said to me, "Oh, it's okay, you'll make new friends." And what she basically did was invalidated the fact that I was really sad about this particular friend leaving. And this idea of expressing emotions and sharing emotions is so, so important to create really strong bonds between your child and to teach them that. And so many organizations are starting to teach more about the expression of emotion at a younger age, even starting here, so that they can do that. I did I think it was only with, I did each group I've been working with for different amount of times based on how the schedule works. In 6th and 7th grade and 9th and 10th grade got to do this, where I asked them, I formed 2 lines and I said, write as many, I'm going to time you, write as many, so what it was is that one person would go up to the board and write and then give the pen to the next person and they'd come back. Just start writing as many emotions as you can on the board. And the range I got was between 9 and 22. That was as many emotions that the students could actually write. And then when we started saying, is that really emotion? Some of them even crossed off a few. And it made me realize that the emotional language of our students is very small. It's not been developed a lot because we don't always give a lot of time to that. And I know for me in my work, a lot of times when I get the, there's no students around, the he said, she said story, because sometimes they want to come in and tell me all of this stuff. A lot of times it's not what happened that's so important, it's what was shared, or what the feeling was. And that I can validate that feeling back is sometimes the most important thing they want. That's sometimes what the kids want. And one of the things kids tell me the most that parents do is they try to jump to solutions. They try to figure it out. But that validating, and if you click to the next slide, the validating is, we did the sharing, we'll go on. The validating is really important, and this is where I'm going to wrap up with just a few ideas between the learning, the academic, the social, and the emotional. But ways that you can do this is really to ask open-ended questions. A lot of times the question is, did you do any homework you have? Or did you get your classwork done? That kind of thing. But just what are you doing? What are you reading? What are you learning? These kind of questions really reinforce the learning. And I think green school parents are pretty good about doing that sort of thing. But even getting them, why is it important that you're learning that? And you can then start make connections with, oh, aren't you learning about this in science class? And you can kind of make those connections. And then start to really decipher what is helping you to learn. What is blocking you from learning? These kind of conversations can really help reinforce learning. The next slide is, how do you reinforce the social? The first thing is just listen and learn to ask questions. And part of that is the listening, so that you ask a question to listen. You don't ask a question to solve. Just listen and let them talk about it. I think it's really important in this day and age that we send messages of inclusivity. I think that there's a lot of social exclusion that happens, and so even how we as parents are inclusive with each other is really important to send that message. Sometimes practicing role playing. So a lot of times a student will say, tell you, oh my gosh, these kids aren't letting me in their group. They're not I feel excluded. Start saying, well, what could we say? I'm going to pretend I'm the person who's not letting you in, or who, has sent you this message. What are you going to say back? And practicing that. Let them practice. And the other thing is empathy. I even showed a movie from Brene Brown, a clip to the grade 12s, and some of them were like, that really helps me to understand what empathy is. Teaching empathy is really important, and what that means is we get into the feeling of the other person. We have to take on their feeling. And as parents, we sometimes don't want to do that. We want to fix it. They come in and they're so upset. Just being able to say, wow, that must be tough. I can't imagine what you're going through. But it requires us to tap into what we're feeling, and when we feel that, we want to fix it. Whereas all we really need to do on the next slide is raise emotionally resilient kids. Paraphrase what you hear. I hear you say that you're feeling so isolated and alone and empty. They can then say, well, not quite alone and empty, but it gives them that ability to go back and forth. Express your own emotions. It's amazing how many kids who can't express their emotions to me will tell me, my parents don't express their emotions. I never know what they're saying. And you can be such a great role model to express them. And if you express them a bit badly, maybe you need to apologize sometime. I'm sorry I got so mad last night. I'm going to learn how to be better. I don't think, I mean, maybe there's, you know, this idea of yelling, shaming, scolding. I know that when we talk about how we were raised, a lot of times we were raised too by parents who scolded us, who shamed us into being better. But that doesn't help us. That just sticks with us so that we feel, I think, a little bit worse about ourselves in that. And again, avoid the problem solving, especially with high schoolers. High schoolers should know how to solve the problem. I read an interesting book. Some of it was more Americanized, but I love the premise where he said, as your kid grows up, you change your parenting style, and you go from being a manager to being a consultant. And I thought that's really good because we do manage a lot. Oh, do you have your sports equipment? Here, did you do your homework? And we do all of this managing of when they're younger, and then we don't know how to stop. And a lot of times the older students, they don't want to be managed. They want to try it on their own and then wait till they can come to ask for advice. And I know, I made a lot of mistakes as a parent, but I know one thing I did is I really kept that communication open so that he could always feel comfortable coming in to talk to me and share. And there were times when I was just like, oh, I want to give him advice. Even harder for me because I saw what was going on in school all day. And I'd be like, oh, I can see that going on. I know what I could tell him to do. No, don't tell him what to do. Let him do that. So a lot of times I think this, avoiding the problem solving is really, really important. And do I have any more? That might be about where I'm. I wanted to kind of finish with, we have a small group here, but I know Dan and Harriet and I are looking at what kind of topics you would like to hear. I have heard already from some parents to do something about social media, how to help with that. Wish I had all the answers on that one, but it's something we can do together. But do you have an idea?
Just when you were speaking about, like the grieving, so they've potentially grieved the countries that they've left, but I guess tools for helping us manage the kids around the transient nature of green school. They've got friends going all the time and how they deal with that. And then even like, this holidays, my daughter, all of her friends are gone for 4 weeks. So she's already quite isolated in her room on her tech, and now all of her friends are going. So then that's another 4 weeks of how I, tools and techniques to, I guess, inspire her and drag her out of the bedroom without her kicking and screaming.
I think that's a great topic for international schools right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a list here that we were putting together.
Are there any at home?
This one? Okay. One was around gaming, social media, as you said, sex education, risk-taking. Yeah.
Great.
That was in our list.
That's good. And you have some from home? Okay.
So I think the risk-taking previously we had for high school. It was for high school. It was about alcohol, drugs, specifically to Bali.
Okay. Yeah,
motorbike
I think that's really
driving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I think that's all covered by the risk-taking.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah.
So one thing that I always find interesting, and I've lived overseas for over 30 years, and we have one kid born in Japan, one in Singapore. My wife's Canadian. I'm American. I mean, we're like all over the place. But I think sometimes, and that the third culture, I mean, we've been talking about this for a decade, but I think we sometimes approach it that a third culture kid, it's kind of negative and not the norm. And then we always talk about, being the norm is sitting back in Oklahoma where you never leave the home for 150 years and, and all. And so you're not doing it here today. I think this is actually a very healthy conversation. But I think we need to sort of turn this on its head. Like my kids, they really don't care. They don't care what country they're from. It's hilarious when you ask them where they're from. When you ask them what their favorite thing to do in America is, they say, they love the subways. And people go, you're from New York? And they're, no, we like the Subway sandwich shops, right? And it's their context is so different, but it's because we don't tell them, oh, well, you're missing out because you don't have a friend that you've been friends with for 50 years. And so I think this is something that I think we should embrace here as a beautiful thing that is the norm, rather than something that is a little bit weird and different. But acknowledging things like the turnover of friends and stuff like that is challenging. I completely agree with that. But I think we can tweak this a little bit and come at it from a slightly different angle. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. And when I did the activity with the students, what they said is they said, the 9th and 10th grades, we really appreciate being able to talk about this. You allowed us to have the conversation, kind of, in a sense, to talk about our cultural differences and within our culture, you know. And so sometimes it's just about giving them that opportunity. Just like their slideshow was a little different in the end, where I started to talk about the strengths that come from this and what they're learning, like when I had the benefits and challenges. But I think you're right. And I think the dialogue is changing with the digital nomads, and the world is becoming a lot smaller. But one of the bigger challenges is with the social media coming in. What are the messages? And just like for me, I'm worried that there are some social media messages that the kids are getting that aren't coming from any particular culture, but they're coming from from consumerism or from things like that, that we still have to teach them how to navigate that. But good point. Yep.
Oh, I mean, I think the Green School is very, very good at sort of empowering girls. But I think that there's a lot of boys who would benefit from talks about how to parent boys and how to empower boys. And there's a book I spoke to you about called The Boy Crisis by Warren Riddle, who talks about it a lot. And it's sort of how they're being a bit forgotten. And I remember we did a talk here where I was taking the counter-argument to the patriarchy. And a couple of boys came up to me in secret afterwards and said, oh, I totally agree with you, but I can't say anything. And so I think that is something we tend to forget, and probably would be good if we did more on.
Well, and I think the Me Too movement and also the Black Lives Matter movement kind of swung things, as often happens, into one way or the other. But I think that could be a really good topic. And I will say, I ran I called it Psychology, Mental Health, and Teens, an elective for kids this last block. And I was really excited to have boys and, equal number of boys and girls want to take the class. So that really helped enrich that dialogue. But I think boys are right. And I think also we need to have a little bit of a discussion sometimes about race and racism. A lot of the international schools right now have been talking a lot about that and talking about white privilege and talking about some of these things. And it is something that comes up in a lot of cultures that I've lived in, where we are in a host country, and how are we embracing that side as well? I mean, I think we do a great job here with that, and there's so much celebration and coming together. But again, teaching our kids to have these conversations, we have those conversations, I think, can be really important. Any others? Any other topics?
I mean, there is here, Jill is saying how to transition into the school, like Green School, and the transit nature of an international school. Andrew said, I agree with those already suggested. Social media, risk-taking, and how to navigate in an increasingly polarized world.
Okay. So we will all take note, and I see that both Sal and Kate have come in at the time when we're talking about the what we're going to be doing with our future workshops. We're looking at how to do that and bring in people, as well as have discussion groups and presentations. But I think that this is a great community that can really come together and help shape some of the ways we go forward, both as parents and as with our student population. So, thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, thank you. That was so good. Thank you so much. We might have a few moments for more questions if anyone wants, but it's already 2:45. So do you guys have any other questions that you want to bring forward? Or okay, Luke, of course, why? Okay, and then we close, because we still have a few time, and it's such an interesting conversation.
It's one I wanted to ask earlier. As I said, I was sort of growing up with all of these kids all my life. And what I found, especially with the women, was some of them seemed to do very well with moving, but a pretty big chunk kind of fell to pieces a bit, and felt a bit sort of in the wind. I was talking to my friend here, one where they were sort of either super kind of following what they thought that maybe their parents wanted. One became sales in Goldman Sachs and then quit and became a doula. And then, you know, sort of, I found there was quite a lot of being a bit in the wind. And so I was trying to wonder, what do I do for my daughters, because they're going to be in the same group? How do you fall into the ones who deal with it rather well and not being the ones that sort of are a bit all over the place?
Well, I think you also have to. I think you also have to take into account individuals. You know, my sister and I had the same upbringing, and we took vastly different paths from that. So a lot of times personality comes into it. I think those losses, you know, individually can sometimes play a part in that. But at least from my experience, I would not say it's typically a lot of girls who maybe wander a little bit. Maybe it is, and if you did some studies, but the research on that was done over the last, even I saw something about maybe 8 years ago about third culture kids. It actually said that kids who are raised in international schools have a much higher rate of transitioning in university, of going to a different university. They will start at one and move to another, and they think it's because of the frequent moves and all the opportunity. They start to see more opportunities out there, and so I think a lot of times just getting them to focus in on an interest, and this would probably be, I think sometimes, and maybe I over-exaggerate it, but because of a lot of moves when I was really little, and even though it was in the United States, I never could really finish with my gymnastics, and then I did horseback riding, and then I did, and because depending on where we were, I just did different things based on what was in front of me, and I think that can sometimes maybe have an impact. So having one thing that kids learn how to do and can continue with can be really helpful. Learning a musical instrument or something like that can sometimes help that. And then also looking at role models. There was a really nicely done colored book, I'll have to remember the name of it, but a couple women did it, and it has different women, famous women in history, just one page to read about them. And yes, that book, what was it? Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls, allows them to see that in order to be this scientist, you have to continue, you have to really push on with that. And then also I would say question whether or not it's necessarily a negative thing. Nowadays, we do change careers so often, and that can actually be really enriching. So, looking at it through, it really depends on the lens you look at it through. But I think we can also talk more about that to kind of help. I don't know if I gave a real clear answer.
Yeah, that's really good, Ibu. And I think that we're going to wrap up. But as you said, the idea is to start these conversations. And I love that we are actually a small group today, and we could really have like a focused conversation. And the idea is to get these topics that we just raised there and do circles of conversation. So we can talk about this, so important, and we can share, because I think that for me at least, being able to kind of share with you girls and listen different perspective, and just to, I've been here for many years, and I actually think that there is a lot of the things that you told me today that kind of really helped me to understand, like, wow, the challenges also that Tiago faces, from the perspective that although I have lived in Portugal, I wasn't really a third culture kid, so I didn't have the same challenges, so I cannot speak from the space of living it like you did, so it was very enriching for me. And I think that for all of us here, the opportunity for us to be talking about these hot topics would be really good for us to, share concerns and understand better and navigate better into this, journey that it's parenting and raising our kids. Yeah, that, I don't know, they didn't come with an instruction manual, Ibu, so we try to do our best, I think. And thank you so much for being here today. And if you want to, Yes, and if you want to help, I mean, I think that this is really important. The bridge, we really want to be parents-driven. So today is actually a result of parents asking to have this type of conversation. So it's, again, a parent-driven activity. And we would love, if you want to, you know, help to organize things around well-being. And Heikki, you know, and Dan did the free driving the other day, you know. So we really want the community to be able to share their gifts, their, you know, story. Yeah, so please come and talk to us, because the idea is that we open this space for us to be sharing and connecting as a community. Thank you, Ibu.